The Senate had a hearing this week for AI. Sam Altman was there, as well as Gary Marcus, a professor from NYU. That's an overpriced college in New York City. And Christina Montgomery, the chief privacy and trust officer from IBM, which had Watson before anybody else was in the AI business. And I think they deprecated it or they stopped working on it, which is quite paradoxical. There were a couple of very interesting moments. Sam claimed the U.S. should create a separate agency to oversee AI. I guess he's in the Chamath camp. He wants the agency to issue licenses to train and use AI models. A little regulatory capture there, as we say in the biz. He also claims, and this was interesting, dovetailing with Elon's CNBC interview with, I think, Dave Farber, which was very good, that he owns no equity in OpenAI whatsoever and was, quote, doing it because he loves it. Any thoughts, Chamath? You did say that this would happen 2 months ago, and here we are 2 months later, and exactly what you said would happen is in the process of happening. Regulation, licensing, and regulatory capture.
Sam went a little further than I sketched out a few months ago, which is that he also said that it may make sense for us to issue licenses for these models to even be compiled. And for these models to actually do the learning. And I thought that that was really interesting because what it speaks to is a form of KYC, right? Know your customer. And again, when you look at markets that can be subject to things like fraud and manipulation, right? Where you can have a lot of bad actors, banking is the most obvious one. We use things like KYC to make sure that money flows are happening appropriately and between parties that where the intention is legal. And so I think that that's actually probably the most important new bit of perspective that he is adding as somebody right in the middle of it, which is that you should apply to this agency to get a license to then allow you to compile a model. And I think that that was a really interesting thing. The other thing that I said, and I said this in a tweet just a couple of days ago, is I'm really surprised actually where this is the first time in modern history that I can remember where we've invented something, we being Silicon Valley, and the people in Silicon Valley are the ones that are more circumspect than the folks on Wall Street or other areas. And if you gauge the sentiment, the hedge funds and family offices right now are just giddy about AI. And it turns out if you look at their 13Fs, they're all long NVIDIA and AMD. But if you actually look at the other side of the coin, which is the folks in Silicon Valley that's actually making it, the rest of us are like, hey, let's crawl before we walk, before we run.
Yeah, let's think about guardrails. Let's be thoughtful here. And so the big money people are saying, let's place bets. And the people building it are saying, hey, let's be thoughtful, Sacks.
Which is opposite to what it's always been, I think.
Right. We're like, hey, let's run with this. And Wall Street's like, prove it to me. Sacks, you are a less regulation guy. You are a free market monster. I've heard you've been called. You don't believe that we should license this. What do you think about what you're seeing here? And there is some cynical thoughts about what we just saw happen in terms of people in the lead wanting to maintain their lead by creating red tape. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, of course. I think, Sam just went straight for the end game here, which is regulatory capture. Normally, when a tech executive goes and testifies at these hearings, they're in the hot seat and they get grilled. And that didn't happen here because, Sam Altman basically bought into the narrative of these senators. And he basically conceded all of these risks associated with AI. He talked about how ChatGPT style models, if unregulated, could increase online misinformation, bolster cyber criminals, even threaten confidence in election systems. So he basically bought into the senator's narrative and, like you said, agreed to create a new agency that would license models and can take licenses away. He said that he would create safety standards, specific tests that a model has to pass before it can be deployed. He says he would require independent audits who can say the model is or isn't in compliance. And by basically buying into their narrative and agreeing to everything they want, which is to create all these new regulations and a new agency, I think that Sam is pretty much guaranteeing that he'll be one of the people who gets to help shape the new agency and the rules they're going to operate under and what these independent audits are how they're going to determine what's in compliance. So he is basically putting a big moat around his own incumbency here.
And
yes, it is a smart strategy for him. But the question is, do we really need any of this stuff? And, what you heard at the hearing is that just like with just about every other tech issue, the senators on the Judiciary Committee didn't exhibit any real understanding of the technology. And so they all generally talked about their own hobby horses. So, you heard from Senator Blackburn, she wants to protect songwriters. Hawley wants to stop anti-conservative bias. Klobuchar was touting a couple of bills that have her name on them. One's called the JCPA, Journalism Competition and Preservation.
What does Bernie Sanders want to do? He wants to protect the 1% of the 1%?
Yeah, Durbin hates Section 230. That was the hobby horse he was riding. And then Senator Blumenthal was obsessed that someone had published deep fakes of himself. So, all of these different senators had different theories of harm that they were promoting. And they were all basically hammers looking for a nail. They all wanted to regulate this thing. And they didn't really pay much, if any, attention to the ways that existing laws could already be used to stop any of these things.
If you commit a crime with AI, there are plenty of criminal laws.
Every single thing they talked about could be handled through existing law if they amount to being harms at all.
Yeah.
But they want to jump right to creating a new agency and new regulations. And Sam, I think, did the expedient thing here, which is basically buy into it in order to be an insider.
If this was a chess game, Sam got to the mid game, he traded all the pieces and went right to the end game. Let's just try to checkmate here. I've got the lead. I got the $10 billion from Microsoft. Everybody else get a license and try to catch up. Friedberg, we have Chamath pro regulation licensing, I think, or just being pretty thoughtful about it there. You got Sachs being typically a free market monster, let the laws be what they are, but these senators are going to do regulatory capture. Where do you, as the Sultan of Science, stand on this very important issue?
I think there's a more important kind of broader set of trends that are worth noting and that the folks doing these hearings and having these conversations are aware of, which implies why they might be saying the things that they're saying. That's not necessarily about regulatory capture. And that is that a lot of these models can be developed and generated to be much smaller. We're seeing, models that can effectively run on an iPhone. We're seeing a number of open source models that are being published now. There's a group called Mosaic ML. Last week, they published what looks like a pretty good quality model that has, a very large kind of token input, which means you can do a lot with it. And that model can be downloaded and used by anyone for free. Really good open source license that they've provided on that model. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg on what's going on, which is that these models are very quickly becoming ubiquitous, commoditized, small, and effectively are able to move to and be run on the edge of the network. As a result, that means that it's very hard to see who's using what models how behind the products and tools that they're building. And so if that's the trend, then it becomes very hard for a regulatory agency to go in and audit every server or every computer on a network and say, what model are you running? Is that an approved model? Is that not an approved model? It's almost like having a regulatory agency that has to go in and audit and assess whether a Linux upgrade or some sort of open source platform that's being run on some server is appropriately vetted and checked. And so it's almost like a fool's errand. And so if I'm running one of these companies and I'm trying to, get Congress off my butt and get all these regulators off my butt, I'm going to say, go ahead and regulate us. Because the truth is, there really isn't a great or easy path or ability to do that. And there certainly won't be in 5 or 10 years. Once these models all move on to the edge of the network and they're all being turned around all the time, every day, and there's a great evolution underway. So I actually take a point of view that it's not just that this is necessarily bad and there's cronyism going on. I think that the point of view is just that this is going to be a near impossible task to try and track and approve LLMs and audit servers that are running LLMs and audit apps and audit what's behind the tools that everyday people are using. And I wish everyone the best of luck in trying to do so. But that's kind of the joke of the whole thing. It's like, let's go ahead and pat all these Congress people on the shoulder and say, you got it,
and
you're right.
There you have it, folks. Wrong answer, Chamath and Sachs. Right answer, Friedberg. If you were to look at Hugging Face, if you don't know what that is, it's a basically an open source repository of all of the LLMs. The cat is out of the bag. The horses have left the barn. If you look at what I'm showing on the screen here, this is the Open LLM leaderboard. It's kind of buried on Hugging Face. If you haven't been to Hugging Face, this is where developers show their work, they share their work, and they kind of compete with each other in a social network showing all of their contributions. And what they do here is, and this is super fascinating, they have a series of tests that will take an LLM, a language model, and they will have it do science questions that would be for grade school. They'll do a test of mathematics, US history, computer science, etc.
There's a Jeopardy test too. I don't know if
Yes.
it's on here, but the Jeopardy test is really good. It's like straight up Jeopardy trivia and see if it can answer the questions. Yeah.
Which actually, Friedberg was actually his high school Jeopardy championship 3 years in a row. But anyway, on this leaderboard, you can see the language models are outpacing what OpenAI did. I'm sorry, closed AI is what I call it now because they're closed source. Closed AI and Bard have admitted, that internal person at Bard said, the language models here are now outpacing what they're able to do with much more resources. Many hands makes for light work. The open source models are going to fit on your phone or the latest, Apple silicon. So I think the cat's out of the bag. I don't know how they pull
There's
it back
nothing
in.
incompatible about that. What Friedberg just said with what I said. In fact, Friedberg's point bolsters my point. It's highly impractical to regulate open source software in this way. Also, when you look at that list of things that people are doing on Hugging Face, there's nothing nefarious about it.
Yeah.
And all the harms that were described are already illegal and can be prosecuted.
Exactly.
You don't need some special agency, giving it seal of approval. Again, this is going to replace permissionless innovation, which is what has defined the software industry and especially open source, with the need to develop some connection or relationship and lobbying in Washington to go get your project approved. And there's no really good reason for this except for the fact that the senators on the Judiciary Committee and all of Washington really wants more control so they can get more donations.
Sacks, I have a question. Do you think that creating the DMV and requiring a driver's license limits the ability for people to learn how to drive?
The DMV is like the classic example of how government doesn't work. I don't know why you'd want to make that your example. I mean, people have to spend all day
Chamath's
waiting
never
in
been
line.
To it. He sends people to it. He's got a VIP person.
You got to
who
spend
waits in
all day
line.
waiting in line to get your photo taken. It's insane. I mean,
That's not what I'm
everyone has
asking.
a miserable experience with it. No, but it's highly relevant because you're right. If you create an agency where people have to go get their permission, it's a licensing scheme. You're going to be waiting in some line of untold length. It won't be like a physical line at the DMV building. It's going to be a virtual line where you're in some queue where there's probably going to be some overworked regulator who doesn't even know how they're supposed to approve your project. They're just going to be trying to cover their ass because if the project ends up being something nefarious, then they get blamed for it. So that's what's going to end up happening.
Let me also highlight something that I think is maybe
I think the gun
a little
analogy would be better.
a little bit
but go ahead.
misunderstood. But an AI model is an algorithm, so it's a piece of software that takes data in and spits data out. And we have algorithms that are written by humans. We have algorithms that have been written by machines. These are machine learned models, which is what a lot of what people are calling AI today is effectively an extension of and out of. And so the idea that a particular algorithm is differentiated from another algorithm is also what makes this very difficult, because these are algorithms that are embedded and sit within products and applications that an end user and end customer ultimately uses. And I just sent you guys a link to the EU has been working towards passing this AI Act.
God, here we go.
They're a couple of weeks ahead of these conversations in the US. But I mean, as you read through this AI Act and the proposal that it's put forth, it almost becomes the kind of thing that you say, I just don't know if these folks really understand how the technology works, because it's almost as if they're going to audit and have, an assessment of the risk level of every software application out there. And that the tooling and the necessary infrastructure to be able to do that just makes no sense in the context of open source software, in the context of an open internet, in the context of how quickly software and applications and tools evolve, and you make tweaks to an algorithm and you got to resubmit it for authorization, reauthorization.
You can be sure their number one job, Friedberg, is going to be to protect jobs. So anything there that in any way infringes on somebody's ability to be employed in a position, whether it's an artist or a writer or a developer, they're going to say, you can't use these tools, or they're going to try to throttle them to try to protect jobs, because that's
Can
their
I ask
number
a question,
one
then,
job
of
over there.
all three of you? Do you guys think that this was Sam's way of pulling up the ladder behind him?
Of course,
No.
100%. Just like
No.
absolutely it is, and it's because you can prove it. He made OpenAI, closed AI, by making it not open source.
If you're Sam, you're smart enough to know how quickly the models are commoditizing and how many different models there are that, can provide similar degrees of functionality, as you just pointed out, J-Cal. So I don't think it's about trying to lock in your model. I think it's about recognizing the impracticality of creating some regulatory regime around model auditing. And so you're in that world, in that scenario where you have that vision, you have that foresight, do you go to Congress and tell them that they're dumb to regulate AI, or do you go to Congress and you say, great, you should regulate AI, knowing that it's like, hey, yeah, you should go ahead and stop the sun from shining. It's just,
So basically, he's telling them to do that because he knows they can't.
No.
Therefore, he gets all the points, all the joy points, all the social credit, I don't want to say virtual signaling, but he gets all the credit, relationship credit with Washington for saying what they want to hear, reflecting back to them,
I'll say
even
this.
though he knows they can't compete with Facebook's open model, which is number one.
Yeah, there is historical precedent
Interesting idea.
for companies that are facing congressional scrutiny to go to Congress and say, go ahead and regulate us, as a way of creating relief. Yeah. And I think that it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get regulated, but it's a way of kind of creating some relief and getting everyone to take a breather and a sigh of relief and be like, okay, the industry is with us. They're
Gardez. What do you think of the Gardez strategy? Sacks, the Gardez strategy he's pulling here.
What's Gardez?
I think that's in chess when you are going to take the queen.
What?
It's like anyway, so what do you think of his chess moves?
I can guarantee you that's not a strategy in chess. So I think it is a chess move, nonetheless.
Is he pulling up the ladder, Sacks, or no?
I don't think that's his number one goal, but I think it is the result. And so I think the goal here is, I think he's got two paths in front of him when you go to testify like this. You can either resist and they will put you in the hot seat and just grill you for a few hours, or you can sort of concede and you buy into their narrative, and then you kind of get through the hearing without being grilled. And so I think on that level, it's preferable just to kind of play ball. And then the other thing is that by playing ball, you get to be part of the insiders club that's going to shape these regulations. And that will, I wouldn't say it's a ladder coming up. I think it's more of a moat, because it's not that the ladder comes up and nobody else can get in, but the regulations are going to be a pretty big moat around major incumbents who know they qualify for this because they're going to write these standards. So at the end of the day, if you're someone in Sam's shoes, you're like, why resist and make myself a target? Or I'll just buy into the narrative and help shape the regulations, and it's good for my business.
I like the analysis, gentlemen. This is a perfect analysis.
Let me ask Chamath a question. Chamath, what is the commercial incentive from your point of view to ask for regulation and to be pro-regulation? You're pro-regulation. Can you just highlight for me at least what you think, the commercial reason is to do that? How do you benefit from that? Like, not you personally, but generally, like, where does benefit arise?
I think that certain people in a sphere of influence, and I would put us in that category, have to have the intellectual capacity to see beyond ourselves and ask what's for the greater good. I think Buffett is right. 2 weeks ago, he equated AI to nuclear weapons, which is an incredibly powerful technology whose genie you can't put back in the bottle, whose 99.9% of use cases are generally quite societally positive, but the 0.1% of use cases destroys humanity. And so I think you guys are unbelievably naive on this topic, and you're letting your ideology fight your common sense. The reality is that there are probably 95 billion trillion use cases that are incredibly positive. But the 1,000 negative use cases are so destructive, and they're equally possible. And the reason they're equally possible, and this is where I think there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty here, is we don't even know how transformers work. The best thing that happened when Facebook open sourced Llama was also that somebody stealthily released all the model weights.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Explain
I don't think
a little bit for a neophyte what we're talking about here. So there's the model and there's the weights.
Think about it as it's a solution to a problem. The solution looks like a polynomial equation. Okay? let's take a very simple one. Let's take Pythagorean theorem. X squared plus y squared equals z squared. Okay? So if you want to solve an answer to a problem, you have these weights, you have these variables, and you have these weights associated with it. The slope of a line, y equals mx plus b. Okay? What a computer does with AI is it figures out what the variables are, and it figures out what the weights are. The answer to identifying images flawlessly turns out to be 2x plus 7, where x equals this thing. Now, take that example and multiply it by 500 billion parameters and 500 billion weights, and that is what an AI model essentially gives us as an answer to a question. So even when Facebook released Llama, what they essentially gave us was the equation, but not the weights. And then what this guy did, I think it was an intern apparently or somebody, he just leaked the weights so that we immediately knew what the structure of the equation looked like. So that's what we're basically solving against. But we don't know how these things work. We don't really know how transformers work. And so this is my point when I think you guys are right about the overwhelming majority of the use cases, but there will be people who can nefariously create havoc and chaos. And I think you got to slow the whole ship down to prevent those few folks from ruining it for everybody.
Chamath,
hold on.
Let me just talk with Chamath about this.
I haven't had a chance to chime in on my position, so I'd like to just make my own, if I may.
Nobody cares.
Okay, well, I do. I think actually I split the difference here a little bit. I don't think it needs to be an agency and licensing. I do think we have to have a commission, and we do need to have people being thoughtful about those 1,000 use cases, Chamath, because they are going to cause societal harm or things that we cannot anticipate. And then number two, for the neophyte with the 1600 rating on chess.com, Sacks, Gardez, an announcement to the opponent that their queen is under direct attack, similar to the announcement of Czech. The warning was customary until the early 20th century. So since you do not know the history of Czech, now you've learned something
until
here
the
today.
Early 20th century. Okay, well, since I've only played chess in the 20th and 21st centuries, I'm unaware of that.
J.Cal, in French, it's pronounced garde.
Garde. Très magnifique.
Garde.
Go ahead, Friedberg.
In the context of what we're talking about, that models are becoming smaller and can be run on the edge, and there's obviously hundreds and thousands of variants of these open source models that have good effect and perhaps compete with some of these models that you're mentioning that are closed source. How do you regulate that? How do you and then they sit behind an application they sit behind tooling? Yeah.
I think in order for you to be able to compile that model to generate that initial instantiation, you're still running it in a cluster of thousands of GPUs.
But let's say we're past that.
You can't be past that. We're not past that yet. Okay? We don't have 5 million models. We don't have all kinds of things that solve all kinds of problems. We don't have an open source available simulation of every single molecule in the world, including all the toxic materials that could destroy humans. We don't have that yet. So before that is created and shrunk down to an iPhone, I think we need to put some stage gates up to slow people down.
What do you mean by those stage gates? Yeah.
I think you need some form of KYC. I think before you're allowed to run on a massive cluster to generate the model that then you try to shrink, you need to be able to show people that you're not trying to do something absolutely chaotic or havoc creating. That I don't think that
could be as simple as putting your driver's license in your social security number you're working on an instance in a cloud, right? It could be your putting your name on your work.
It becomes slightly more nuanced than that. It's like, I think that, J.Cal, that's probably the simplest thing for AWS, GCP, and Azure to do, which is that if you want to run over a certain number of GPU clusters, you need to put in that information. I think you also need to put in your tax ID number. So I think if you want to run a real high-scale model, that's still going to run you tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. I do think there aren't that many people running those things, and I do think it's easy to police those and say, what are you trying to do here?
So let me just push back on that, because Mosaic ML published this model that is, I can pull up the performance chart, or Nick, maybe you can just find it on their website real quick of the new model they published. Chamath, they trained this model on open source data that's publicly available, and they spent $200,000 on a cluster run to build this model, and look at how it performs compared to some of the top models that are closed source.
Just say it for the people who are listening.
Yeah, so for people that are listening, basically this model is called MPT-7B. That's the name of the AI model, the LLM model that was generated by this group called Mosaic ML. And they spent $200,000 creating this model from scratch And the data that they trained it on is all listed here. It's all publicly available data that you can just download off the internet. Then they score how well it performs on its results against other big models out there like Llama 7B, GPT.
I know, but I don't exactly know what the actual problems they're trying to ask it to compare.
Right. So, but the point is that this model theoretically could then be applied to a different data set once it's been, built.
I don't think so.
I just want to use your point earlier about toxic chemistry, because models were generated and then other data was then used to fine tune those models and deliver an output.
Hold on a second. Like, those answers were to specific kinds of questions. If you wanted to all of a sudden ask a totally orthogonal thing of that model would fail. You would have to go back and you'd have to retrain it. That training does cost some amount of money. So if you said to me, hey, Chamath, I could build you a model trained on the universe of every single molecule in the world, and I could actually give you something that could generate the toxic list of all the molecules and how to make it for $200,000, I would be really scared. I don't think that that's possible today. So I don't understand these actual tests, but I don't think it's true that you could take this model and these model weights, apply it to a different set of data and get useful answers.
But then let's assume for a minute that you can, in fact, take $200,000 worth of
But I don't
GPU
want to
clusters.
assume it. Here's my point. I want to tell you what's happening right now, which is that's not possible. So we should stop so that then I don't have to have this argument with you in a year from now, which is like, hey, some jerk off just created this model. Now the cat's out of the bag, so let's not do it.
Yeah.
And then what's going to happen is like some chaotic seeking organization is going to print one of these materials and release it into the wild to prove it.
But here's the point for the audience. We are at a moment in time where this is moving very quickly, and you have very intelligent people here who are very knowledgeable talking about to the degree to which this is going to manifest itself, not if it will manifest. You are absolutely 100% certain, Friedberg, that somebody will do something very bad in terms of the chemical example as but one. We're only determining here what level of hardware and what year that will happen. Chamath is saying, we know it's going to happen, whether it's 2 or 10 or 5 years. Let's be thoughtful about it. And I think this discussion we're having here, I think is
and I
super
just think
relevant.
That on a spectrum, this is a unique moment where the most knowledgeable people across every single political spectrum, persuasion, for-profit, non-profit, Democrat, Republican, right? Elon and Sam, I'll just use those as the two canonical examples to demonstrate, are pro-regulation. And then the further and further you get away, the less technically astute you are, the more anti-regulation and like pro-market you are. And all I'm saying is, I think that should also be noted, that that's a unique moment, that the only other time that that's happened was around nuclear weapons. And, that's when Bertrand Russell and Einstein.
True. I actually think it's just politically, I think it's politically incorrect to be anti-regulation right now. I think because of what you're saying, just give me a second. I think because of what you're saying, everyone on the left and the right, it's become popular to be pro-regulation on AI and to say that AI is going to doom the world. And it's unpopular and it's politically incorrect.
Elon and Sam. No, I'm saying
I don't care
Elon
about
and Sam.
I've explained my point of view on Sam. Elon's different, but I think I think it's become politically incorrect to stand up and say, you know what? This is a transformative technology for humanity. I don't think that there's a real path to regulation. I think that there are laws that are in place that can protect us in other ways with respect to privacy, with respect to fraud, with respect to biological warfare, and all the other things that we should worry about.
Elon has said pretty clearly, he doesn't give a shit about what it does to make money or not. He cares about what he thinks. So all I'm saying is that's a guy that's not trying to be politically correct.
Elon has a very specific concern, which is AGI. He's concerned that we're on a path to a digital superintelligence. It's a singularity. And if we create the wrong kind of artificial general intelligence that decides that it doesn't like humans, that is a real risk to the human species. That's the concern he's expressed. But that's not what the hearing was really about. And it's not what any of these regulatory proposals are about. The reality is none of these senators know what to do about that. Even the industry doesn't know what to do about the long-term risk of creating an AGI.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. And so I disagree with this idea that Chamath earlier said that there's 1,000 use cases here that could destroy the human species. I think there's only one. There's only one species level risk, which is AGI. But that's a long-term risk. We don't know what to do about it yet. I agree we should have conversations. What we're talking about today is whether we create some new licensure regime in Washington so that politically connected insiders get to control and shape the software industry. And that's a disaster. Let me give you another detail on this. So in one of the chat groups I'm in, there was somebody who just got back from Washington. I won't say who they are. It's not someone who's famous outside the industry, but they're kind of like a tech leader. And what they said is they just got back from Capitol Hill and the White House. And I guess there's like a White House summit on AI. You guys know about that?
Yeah.
So what this person said is that the White House meeting was super depressing. Some smart people were there, to be sure, but the White House and VP's teams were rapidly negative, no real concern for the opportunity or economic impact, just super negative.
Of course.
So basically, the mentality was that tech is bad. We hate social media. This is the hot new thing. We have to stop it.
Of course.
That basically is their attitude. They don't understand the
You're
technology.
talking about the White House, yeah.
The White House, yeah, and the VP specifically, because she's now the AI czar.
To put Kamala Harris in charge of this makes no sense. I mean, does she have any background in this? Like, it just shows like a complete, utter lack of awareness. Where's the Megan Smith or somebody like a CTO to be put in charge of this? Remember, Megan Smith was CTO under, I guess, Obama. Like, you need somebody with a little more depth of experience here, like hopefully in the multi-decade
are you guys then saying you're pro-regulation depending on who's in charge?
Well, I'm pro-thoughtfulness. I'm illustrating
that really this whole new agency that's being discussed is just based on vibes.
You're not down with the vibes?
Vibes.
Are these vibes bumming you out?
No, the vibe is that a bunch of people in Washington don't understand technology and they're afraid of it.
Yeah,
so anything you're afraid of, you're going to want to control.
These are socialists, David. They're socialists. They hate progress. They are scared to death that jobs are going to collapse. They're socialists. They're union leaders. This is their worst nightmare. Because the actual truth of this technology is 30% more efficiency, and it's very mundane. This is the true fear, I think, that representatives have. 30% more efficiency means Google, Facebook, and many other companies, finance, education, they do not add staff every year. They just get 30% more efficient every year. And then we see unemployment go way up, and Americans are going to have to take service jobs, and white-collar jobs are going to be refined to like a very elite few people who actually do work in the world. There is absolutely
There'll be a lot of new companies. If knowledge workers can become 30% more productive, there'll be a lot of new companies.
Absolutely.
And the biggest shortage in our economy is coders.
Right. And we're going to have an unlimited number of them now. They're all going to go 10x.
Yeah, I don't know if it's unlimited, but yes, it's a good thing if you give them superpowers. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
So I think it's too soon to be concluding that we need to stop job displacement. That hasn't even occurred yet.
I'm not saying it's actually going to happen. I do agree there'll be more startups. I'm seeing it already. I just think that's what they fear. That's their fear and that's the fear of the EU. The EU is going to be protectionist, unionist, protect pro workers, which is fine.
Unions aren't going to be affected because these are not blue collar jobs we're talking about. These are knowledge workers.
There's white collar unions now. All the media companies created unions, and look at them. They're all circling. All these media companies are circling the drain and going out of business.
But that's on the margins. I mean, that's not.
They're trying to start tech unions.
Sure, they're trying to start them. But when we think of unionized workers, you're thinking about factory workers, and these people are not affected.